And then the district decides how many teachers to buy and paraprofessionals and textbooks and things, and divvies those up across schools. So your school gets 32 teachers plus a librarian, etc. The next school over gets 39 teachers, a librarian and a nurse, and so on. That's the model where the district's making a lot of those decisions. In the middle column, what the district is doing is sort of passing along dollars to each school, and then schools make decisions. So they might say each school gets $6,000 per pupil plus another 1,000 if for each student who low income, and maybe another 1,000 for each EL student, and so on. And that model in the middle column is in place in Boston and in New York City, Atlanta, a lot of bigger urban districts, Chicago, Denver, Nashville, Memphis. So large urban districts have increasingly drifted toward that model, San Francisco, in recent years. And partly for equity reasons and partly because they may be hoping the schools use the flexibility that they have. And the third model I feel like we need to put on there, because that's kind of how charters operate. It's more of a shared services model where the money is actually generated by each school directly. And then if you're in a CMO, the school chips in some money toward the centralized structure. And it's important to sort of recognize the flip nature of that each school sort of sees the money that's generated as its own, and then is giving money to the district. That's the opposite really model of the first two, where the district gets the money and it belongs to the district, and the district is deciding how much goes to the school. So we'll come back there again, but as you can see in the first two models, it's really the district that decides how much money to give each school, and it might give some schools more than others. And that's increasingly becoming a question, and we haven't really had data on that. So that's annoyed me for decades. And I'll just be honest about it, because Lucy, who's on my team, said, you should bring this study. And I was like, are you kidding? That's like, gosh, 2 decades old. I worked on that when I was much younger and much better looking and all those things. But I decided, I am going to bring this because it just shows how long we've been worried about this issue. And actually, as of today, we really don't have much progress on it. So my entire career has been a waste, and I'll just declare that right here. But oftentimes what we were finding is that there is a lot of variation in spending between schools, maybe even more variation than between districts. And why was everybody paying attention to finance at the district level and then just sort of, not paying attention what the money got to the school? And here is way back when salaries were lower, but you can see in the northeast zone of Seattle, where I live, the salaries were higher. That's a more affluent end of the city. And on the southeast side, the salaries were much lower. Same district, same access to money, but we were going to pay teachers more to teach more affluent kids on the north side of the city. And you know how that happened, right? They're more senior, they've been there longer, and the whole deal. But it does mean that we've been driving more dollars to schools with more advantaged students. And if you subscribe to the theory that how you spend your money is your strategy, then I guess we were trying to expand the achievement gap. That's what we were trying to do. So anyway, a lot of times the money that would be generated at a particular school by the students in a school wouldn't actually land on that school. That money would then be diverted to another school once it got inside the district. And so we have been paying attention to this for a really long time. But each time we looked at it, we had to kind of dig up into the data, and then something amazing happened. I hope you appreciate this adorable picture of this little girl that we downloaded off we bought the photo. That's right, we did. It's a legitimate photo. Anyway, Essa came along almost 5 years ago and had a requirement in it. And the requirement said states have to publish how much was spent by school. And this was going to be the dawn of the new era of school finance. And so a lot of work needed to be done because accounting systems weren't ready, and There wasn't anything in the federal law that said how this was going to happen. But we, as you can imagine, were very excited about this new requirement because we didn't have to kind of go try to line up salary schedules and school data and stuff to try to create a picture of spending. So up till now, all we've been doing was looking in from the ed finance perspective at this top half of the chart here, that we only ever had data on districts. And so we spent a lot of time worried about federal formulas, worried about state and local funding formulas. And that drove a lot of activity around ed finance, both research and policy, at this level of state formulas, local formulas, and the sum of spending at districts. And now that we were going to get all this information on the bottom half of this graph, like what actually happens to the money, how much goes to this school or that school, these new data on allocations really open up a substantial new research and policy opportunities. So if you sense some enthusiasm, then yes, we're very enthusiastic and exciting for lots of reasons, not the least of which is the equity front, but also kind of on the productivity front. So we had outcomes by school for years, right? Because No Child Left Behind said, we're going to measure outcomes by the unit of the school. The unit of the school matters. You can have a district. Some schools are great, some are lousy, and we need to know for each school. And so that surfaced long time ago, and we started paying attention to this and worrying about it. And yet we never had the spending by the school. So what we ended up finding was that you would go to a school and say, your outcomes are lousy. And they would say, well, we don't have enough money. And that we couldn't really even have that conversation or really dig in and say, is it the fact that they're shortchanged, or are we not spending it in a way that leverages results? Where are we with that? So this was a really exciting, in my mind, development that we're going to be able to actually have outcomes by school and spending by school and be able to look at how that's gone on. So I'll give you a Essa expenditure reporting life cycle. So this is the school by school data. It's not district, it's now to the unit of school. That passed December 2015, and the Essa required the SEAs. So it's not a federal collection, right? So it's going to be some messiness from one state to the next. And they were going to have to publish the school expenditures. They changed the deadline a couple times, but by June 2020. There are no uniform variable definitions. And that meant that states had a lot of work to do. You can guess the districts were not super thrilled about this. We'll talk more about that. And so what we did at our research center is we launched something called the FITWIG, the Financial Transparency Working Group. And we invited SEAs and anybody who's going to work on this in the SEA to join our meetings. We met monthly, but actually at the beginning we met twice a month, and they were completely voluntary. We didn't charge any money for that. We ended up funding it with grants, and they were sort of off the record conversations, and we were going to share notes and talk to each other about how to get this worked out. So that group, by the way, is still a group. So all these years later, I think we ended up with 45 states that joined. So it was very popular in terms of a tool to kind of affect how they made their decisions. And then and guess what? They mostly did. So the reporting deadline was June 30th. I think we're at something like 45 states have some sort of level of data up. And that's exciting. There's still a lot of differences in how the data report from one state to the next, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And at Georgetown, what we said was, this is great. The data is on the report card. It could be taken down at any moment. It's not sort of aggregated in a way that allows for research. It's not coded to the school identifier. You can't marry it with outcomes data or student demographic data. And we got a grant from both the Gates Foundation and the federal government to build the school spending data archive. So we're scooping up all that data, scrubbing it, cleaning it, capturing it, and trying to establish like variables with the goal that maybe someday, who knows when in the future, will have a uniform federal school expenditure data collection. So we see ourselves in this data archive as a step maybe towards that, because there are some differences across states, and this turns out isn't a panacea, but it's a huge step forward. So that's where we are in that process. So here's how the data are typically reported, and this will be probably, I mean, feel a little bit disappointing for some people, but the data, it doesn't say how much did you spend on reading coaches? How much did you spend on math textbooks? It doesn't do that. It says how much did you spend? And the federal is broken out, but what we did was we worked with states to come up with some common metrics that they could opt into that would allow us to have comparable data across states. And what many of them are reporting at a minimum looks like this. You have some site level expenditures, meaning teachers, librarians, stuff like that. And then obviously central office spends a bunch of money on the HR department, on finance, things like that. How do you divvy that up? You could come up with some complex formula like the superintendent's salary, or you could just acknowledge this is a shared expense and I'm going to divide it out per pupil. And so it turns out there's a lot of money there, because most transportation systems might be a contract they're doing to a provider. Even food service could be there. So what you're really getting at the site level is a lot of the things that are existing in terms of labor or other direct site purchases. So you see a lot of money still at central. And it's the totals here that can be compared, because one of the things is different states will, and even maybe even different districts will put different things in the central bucket. So one might say, all our reading coaches work at central office and they go out and visit the schools, so I coded them to central office. And another district might say, really? I put the reading coach as a school expense. And yes, I have a reading coach working half-time at one school and half-time at the other, and I allocated their salary directly. So that happens, and there's not much we can do about that now, but this is kind of where the data are. So let's see what we're finding, first of all. Like I said, we're kind of excited about this. When we go to look at the data, and I'm going to show you some in a minute, one of the things we're noticing right away are LEA, the district policies shortchanging any schools. Oftentimes we're sort of looking at the numbers going, what gives? You know, like, why are you spending so little or so much on this one or the other one? Do allocations for high need students, do they actually augment spending at high need schools? Are salary problems an issue? Patterns an issue? Are what share of the dollars are accounted for centrally? So if a district is put 60% of the money in central office, that will probably raise some conversations. And then these ones, relative to meaningful peers, how well are dollars being leveraged to drive outcomes? And that means we have to marry up the data with student outcomes, and I'll show you a little bit about how we've been playing around with that. And are there more purposeful ways that a district could deploy its funds? So we start with these kind of as practical questions, thinking they'll end up driving some of the research, and they're not. There's some thorny questions in here. So I'm going to put one out as a poll. Well, first I'm going to do this, then I'll do the poll, sorry. Here's an example. And this district is a little bit north of Boston, I think. And this one of the early ones we've done it on a lot more. But first thing we did was we pulled the spending for all the elementary schools and we lined it up from lowest to highest. And we said, okay, they spend $12,000 at one of their schools, as much as $15,000 per pupil on the high end. And we brought it to a board meeting. And so what we're noticing here is, yes, there's a difference between the high spending and the lowest spending schools of about 3,000, I mean, not some change, right? 3,000 per pupil. And then we put a couple of other things up. This is the highest poverty school. Okay, well, that's decent. At least it's on the right side of the curve. And this is the second highest poverty school. So I'll tell you what, there's nothing that made a school board wake up more than having this single chart land in front of them in a meeting. And then suddenly all the questions are like, how is this happening? I thought we were spending more in our highest poverty schools. How is this one? And they know all the schools, right? They know the context of the schools, all the stuff we don't even have right here. But they know which one is which and who's at one and why would that be more and what past promises were made. And it sort of erupts into a very lively conversation here. And as often happens, part of it is simply accounted for by teacher salaries, whether a school has predominantly higher salary teachers or lower salary, knowing that we, as you know, pay for teachers based on a salary schedule that's mostly tied to longevity. So this was really interesting, and you could see the district sort of thinking about its role in divvying up resources more differently than it ever had in the past. So here's my question for you all. For those of you who are on the Zoom, if you want to do the poll question, it should pop up here in a second. If a district finds it has uneven spending across schools, and that's due to uneven teacher salaries, do you think it should move to remedy that uneven spending? So go ahead, don't overthink it. A simple yes or no. I'm sure people are like, where's the it depends button, but I think we could put it on there. You saw that I brought up the issue way back when in 2004 when I started uncovering these things. But and I will also tell you, when we teach our certificate in Ed Finance, we ask this of all different kinds of groups. And our groups include district CFOs, district leaders, school boards, principals, higher state agencies, and so on. And what we find is that people are not, also whoever's eating their lunch is really rude not to share. No, people may be hearing the noise I'm hearing on that one. So it's a very crunchy noise. It's probably potato chips, but okay. So when I look at this, let's go ahead and post the results. Last chance to vote. All right, and then we'll put the results up. No, the results didn't go up, did they? Yeah, there it is. Okay. It looks like in this group, 71% of you said yes, and 29% of you said no. And that is super interesting. I think sometimes we're actually closer to 50-50, but in this group, it seems like the majority said yes. I imagine on the yes side, the idea is, well, those are public dollars, and why should we be shortchanging a school? And then on the no side, people said, well, a junior teacher is no worse than a senior teacher, so it doesn't really matter. In which case the yes people are probably saying something like, well, it does matter because now I don't have money left over that I could spend on maybe my high need schools because I've tied it all up in senior teacher salaries, and maybe we should change the way we structure salaries as part of that. And on the no side, people say, you just want me to rearrange the teachers and they will all leave if I do that. And you can see how it goes back and forth, right? And I would say that if you're an adamant yes, here's the deal. Districts haven't. These data, we've sort of pressed on this problem for decades. And even when we talk to superintendents and board members, they go, I know that's an issue, especially in our district. Anyway, moving on, and they're not making those changes. And a lot of times schools with higher poverty concentrations have a hard time attracting or retaining teachers. So they get the sort of bottom of the barrel hires, and they might be lower salaried, turnover faster. And it's all kind of hardwired into the lower spending, right? Because they don't have any money left over to do anything about it. So this ends up being a really big issue, but one that sort of sat there quietly simmering for decades, in part because there was never any way to see it. And it's not the only type of inequity we see in districts, and not every district has it, but sometimes we see districts spending more on their science school or their North End schools or their lakefront schools or their who knows what. Sometimes it's just the smaller schools that get more money when the smaller schools are low income, under enrolled schools. Maybe that's spending more on schools in a way that is good. If the smaller schools are like they are in Oakland, kind of more in the hills, just smaller campuses that include more affluent students, then, you know, maybe that's not so intentional. So I think what we're finding here is that it's a complicated problem to solve, but one of the issues has been we haven't had information on that. So I'm going to go in a little bit further on this. So we started this work with states about trying to get these data and surface them. And I'll tell you, not surprising, here's what we heard. I don't want to do that because more advantaged families are going to see how much we spend on high need students, and they're going to push back. So, you know, ignorance is bliss. SEAs and LEAs don't have the capacity to do this. Our accounting systems can't do it. We heard things like, there's an actual quote, so I put in quotes, "This is stupid and insulting. The community won't understand why we spend the way we do." This was a district official who was like, "Stop trying to babysit us," or something, I think is what they thought. And, you know, more federal requirements to micromanage us. Wow, that's just great. So it wasn't a whole lot of love, especially at the district level, for this exciting new data collection. And I'm going to tell you in a minute about how we got there. But before I do that, I want to point out, I'm going to fast forward ahead to the kinds of things being done with the data now. And this is one of them. This is a scatter plot in North Carolina. An outside group has scooped up the state data, put it into a Tableau scatter plot. You can look at it online. I think I have the link there to that if you wanted to. And it comes with all these filters, and I've kind of pasted the filters around the perimeter. But you could say, I'm going to look at all schools in the state. I'm only going to look at elementary schools that are high poverty. That's what we've done here. They're all 75% or more low income. And I'm only going to look at schools about the same size. And they have this school achievement score. They got some other growth scores and stuff you could change on the left-hand metric. But you could see, you could start to array them and say, I've got 4 quadrants here. I've got schools that are that first quadrant, high spending, high outcomes. And if we go counterclockwise, you know, on the left, upper left, those are kind of our ROI superstars, right? They don't spend that much, but they somehow beat the odds for their kids. And because a lot of these schools serve really the same types of students. And if you go to the lower left-hand quadrant, these are schools that, you know, if they say, well, we're shortchanged, we can't do well by our students, they're right. They don't get as much money as most of their peer schools. And if you, in the lower right-hand quadrant, high spending, low outcomes. These are expensive, lousy schools. So I say that just for shorthand here, trying to be blunt, sort of for effect right now. But a lot of people sort of never had to kind of look at it that way, that we put a lot of money in these schools, and yet we're not able to, at least right now, get a return for kids, especially when we line up these schools compared to schools with a similar mix of kids. And that you could see how this really could change a conversation in a district. It could change a conversation in a state. It could change how we go about and do research on reforms that we're trying in schools, and who we consider our comparable peers, and so on. So let me go back, going around in this story here. But let's go back to the FitWig. This is our 4-year voluntary monthly meetings with the SEAs, and where these were the people in the SEA that are sort of oftentimes 4 people down, you know, they're in whatever fluorescent lit sub-basement, tasked with meeting this part of the requirement, and not necessarily happy about it, but they're not like every day working with the ed chief on, you know, the priorities of the state. But then again, we're all sort of depending on them. So we met regularly. Our goals together were knowledge and process sharing. And the process sharing is like, we got to train districts how to do this. We got to design a website. We've got to figure out how we're going to scoop up the data, what variables. And they together came up with a goal of having some common reporting standards. We all published a document together on that called the IFR, Interstate Financial Reporting. And they wanted to track their progress against each other. So they have this, I have this so far. So we did a lot of that together, and we'd highlight different states along the way. And I would say we worked hard on also giving them time to commiserate with their peers and share humor. I mean, this is pretty geeky stuff. And the humor, the sort of the kinds of pull some goofy meme off the internet that has to do with Halloween and dressing up in a finance costume or something like that, is the kind of glue, I think, that kept this group together. So we had a lot of that. And I would say people over time really considered everybody else on the call to be their friends. And we did one in-person meeting along the way. And a lot of people came. They flew from places as far as Hawaii, which is a very long flight, to DC. And people just sort of kept the conversation going. So we're excited about that as a strategy to try to build a data set, because we couldn't be even thinking about this goal of assembling the data archive without all the work they did in doing this. And many of them were up against their districts who weren't necessarily thrilled, like I said. So one of the things we gave them were actual quotes that they could say, or they could ask their districts to think about saying. Because some people were like, I'm okay with this. I just, this is going to be a heavy lift for us. Or we're going to get a lot of negative attention when this stuff comes out, or I'm worried about that. So things like the district and superintendent could say, yes, uneven spending patterns across our schools deserve our attention. We want to hear from the community on this issue, or we're looking at this, we're trying to figure out the best way to proceed going forward, or this is new for us too. So they almost needed words to not be defensive. And these things got shared out. It's kind of interesting because we're like, hey, say this. And they would do these kinds of things. And many of them ended up in columns, documents, and stuff like that. The SEA could say things like, the new site provides the tools districts need to better leverage their limited dollars to do more for students. And reporting the data this way is new for all of us. This is a great time to engage with your district about the patterns that you see, so that people could sort of see this as, yes, it's new. Yes, we're going to learn some things. And yes, we're going to spend some time figuring out how to move forward instead of defend the past. But we also got another big quote in the news, which came from a Department of Ed official who said, most of them, the states, are trying to hide their website as far underneath as possible so no one ever finds it. And this made the news. It was actually, I don't think it was totally unfair. It was hard to find them, but we worked then with the state agencies on how accessible the data was. We said, well, one way is kind of say, how many clicks from the SEA home does it take to retrieve even a single school's per pupil expenditure data, assuming they knew exactly where to go and they took no wrong paths. We did the same thing if you wanted to line up all your schools, and the clicks were much higher, but we're just showing this for illustration. And then we would show them, where they landed at the time on that and say, well, is there anything fair about this, that it's kind of hard to find? And there's a lot of issues. We would ask them to ask somebody who's not used to your site. They had a hard time reading it, going through the data and so on. So I think I would say that we all embrace this, and that's been helpful because we're actually one of the users. And Lucy's on the call with me, but we're building this. We have this new graphic here, school by school archive, and I'm going to give you a little bit more about it in a minute, because we're going to offer these mini grants where people can dig in as the data emerge and do research on it, and so on. And what we're doing in the archive is compiling the national data sets from all the states and districts and normalizing them, preserving them, and making sure that they're coded in a way they can be matched up to demographic data, outcomes data, and then downloaded for a larger scale research or policy analysis. So we're excited about that, and that's that big step along the way. So I'm gonna turn it back to you all for a second on another poll. What do you see as the most exciting use of school by school spending data? There is none, so you can't be not excited. That's not an option. We did not give you that. So here you could drive inequitable dollar allocations. Can we investigate or maybe even promote more equity? Can we uncover the best way to spend money? Can we identify schools beating and lagging the odds with their funds and their mix of students or other? Feel free to put it in the chat on this one.
And Marguerite, it seems like identifying schools beating and lagging the odds was the early winner, and we'll see if that ends up being people's first choice.
All right, great. Because maybe because I showed you that fun graphic from North Carolina. In Massachusetts, MBAE, so if you happen to be in Massachusetts, has a similar scatter plot site up that allows you to filter and play around with the data, both spending and outcomes, which is kind of exciting. Only a couple of states, Illinois, Oklahoma, I think, and a few others have gone that far in arraying spending and outcomes. But right now, mostly that's happening on the outside. So people are scooping up the data and using it to do this. So let's go ahead and post this up here. It looks like you're right. Most are excited about this, which are the schools that are beating and lagging the odds, or just even doing these kind of comparisons. And I put one question in here as a little bit of a decoy, which is the second one, uncover best way to spend money. And part of it is we're not really going to be able to use this data set for that, at least not yet. And that's because the data set doesn't say how the money was spent. It's sort of a where the money was spent. And a lot of people will say, great, now I can't do anything with this information. And it is true that we're a long way from having a uniform capture of what was purchased. Actually, not infinitely long. We're closer and closer every day, and the federal government is trying to work on that. But that's not where we are just yet. So for those of you who are excited about that, you would have to use these data and then go to the district and sort of chase down that extra bit about how the money was used. So I do think there's a lot in here. We too are seeing some of these things like spending equity. That's a big one. A lot of people will say, well, the real equity stuff is at the cross district level. But if you look at some of these districts, I mean, they're sitting on $2 billion or more. I mean, those are mega budgets that are being spent inside a single district. And I'm even thinking about like LA and New York, Miami, Puerto Rico, Clark County, Nevada. I mean, these are massive, massive budgets. So what happens after the money gets to the district is really the whole story. So we want to think about equity at that next level down as well as cost benefit analysis. Like what I think here now, instead of saying, does smaller classes lead to greater outcomes? It'd be like, does the money spent on smaller classes boost learning more than spending that same amount of money on something else, right? So that's where we're going to start, hopefully some point going into these cost benefit analysis, productivity and innovation. What are these kinds of relationships between spending and outcomes, and how do they matter across context? Is it better when the principal has some say in how the money is spent, or not? Is it better, what other kinds of contextual things matter? And then we can still chase some of that up to state funding formulas. Is it better if the state funding formula says this money must be spent on this program? Does that yield an equitable distribution inside school districts or not? And I'm thinking of things like Georgia. Georgia had a state allocation that said every high school gets a graduation coach. And this was an FTE whose job was to get kids to graduate. And the question is, did that drive more money to high poverty schools or lower poverty schools? Did that exacerbate inequities? Because some of that depends on, the size of the school and so on. And school leadership. So there's a lot of relevance here to open up what we think is a massive new door of research. And one, if you're not interested in finance at all, I'm glad you're still here. But one other thing that's an opportunity here is the federal government is asking, you can't just tell me if something worked. You have to tell me how much it cost, or what it's sort of the cost side of that equation is, compared to what else we could have spent the money on. And that's this cost side of the question that even non-finance people are going to have to deal with. And these new data, we think, are going to make that a lot easier to do. So we could start looking at, which quadrant a school was in, they adopted an innovation, how did the dollars spent on that innovation do relative to schools that had the same amount of money but didn't have that innovation. So there's a lot of, I think, really great opportunities there. And I would say, I'll say one last thing before I kind of open it up more broadly to questions, which is that we have this mini grant competition coming up. The new data archive is in the works. It's not quite ready yet. We do have data available. So if you're looking at various states and you're chomping at the bit for data, email us, especially email Lucy, because she could just turn around and send you a file, I think. But there'll probably be some caveats like, oh, make sure you notice this one doesn't have transportation in it, this, that, or the other. But individual states can't be mapped up very well to other states yet, but that is changing rapidly. And we'll have a mini grant competition in spring 2021. We'll have stipends. You can conduct research or even develop a practitioner use case and get some money as part of that, and maybe even come to a conference on it. So if you're interested in applying for that, if you chat your email, we will keep you on the list as that information emerges. And so we're excited about what we hope are the floodgates opening in terms of this new branch of school finance data. And it's well past time. We're ready for it, for this all to happen. Last thing is, we do, if you're new to finance and you're interested in digging deeper, we offer a certificate in ed finance at Georgetown. And we have a lot of district officials, even principals, a lot of grad students, researchers, sometimes a journalist, advocacy groups participate. And it's right now, we have an all virtual cohort starting in October. And it's 2 days in person. Well, I say in person, 2 full days virtual, followed by every other Thursday for 2 hours. And then you get a certificate, you get the credits. If you're a CPA, you get the CPE, the renewal credits that you need. And we just sort of look at finance from a lot of different angles. Super fun. People come with all sorts of different perspectives, rural, urban, the whole thing, and chime in. So we have that accessible and available for anyone who wants to kind of go deeper on this topic of finance. We would love to have you. So those are our email addresses there, so they're handy. And I will stop for a second and see if we have any questions or comments. And I'm looking at one right now that says, a thought, why can't the district charge schools an average and manage the differences centrally? That the way the schools won't be influenced by how much money is coming out of their budget. On the other hand, maximum autonomy for schools can have a greater benefits for schools too. So I think what happens inside schools is that we do this all the time. We basically say, go ahead and hire who you want for the school. And if you hire really senior teachers, we sort of hold you harmless and we manage that cost centrally. But it is true we're spending more on you. And I guess what we're saying here is these data show what we're really spending, not only how we're accounting for it. And that's what's sort of new, because the federal requirement says you had to use real salaries. You can't sort of wash across all the salaries and say, I'm just going to report kind of an average salary per teacher. And I'm not sure that gets at your question, but I'll put that on there. Yeah, so somebody asked, where am I? I'm in Seattle. In the New World Order, you can be remote from your university. So I've actually never lived in DC, and I'm attached to Washington, DC. I mean, I'm attached to Georgetown and live in Seattle, where I've lived for a couple of decades. And I will say, oftentimes I just confuse people and say, yeah, I'm in Washington. What's the question? Because I'm in Washington, right? There's 2 Washingtons. But Georgetown lets me have the greatest gig of all, where I say I don't have to go to faculty meetings, but I teach the certificate program. Sometimes I pop in to my colleagues' classes, but I don't teach semester classes typically. And we do our certificate oftentimes in locations around the country. We've done one in Chicago and Nashville and DC, and we've done one in Seattle and San Francisco. And so we move those certificates around, but right now, of course, we're doing some virtual ones. But yes, I'm in the West Coast, so it's still light out here and all those kinds of things. And let's see, we have, can you say more about cross-state assembly? I'm imagining a case where, like UI data, states can request records from a consortium, states for lists of individuals, something like that. Well, I think what we're doing is we're trying to build a data archive where you could download data for different states, like maybe look at a whole bunch of rural districts across states and analyze their data together in a database. And but the problem is the data in each state aren't right now comparable necessarily. For instance, one state might have left off transportation in their costs. So we'll have an amount of their transportation we can add back in and then say, now you can compare these two apples to apples. So that's what we're trying to do with this. And maybe that is your question, maybe not. Anything else, Lucy, you would want to say about that?
No.
So, all right. And do we have any, Tom, do we have any hands raised I should be answering questions for? And you might be talking, but at least I can't hear you yet. So you might be on mute.
Sorry, I muted myself earlier.
Is that you? Potato chips, I think, probably. Okay.
No, I swear it wasn't me. So folks, if you're new to Zoom, if you have a question, if you go to the bottom of the screen under, I think it's under the participants screen, you can raise your hand. Or you could just put your question in the chat box. But if you want to actually raise your hand and ask the question, you could do it that way.
Looks like Peter has a question.
Okay, Peter's saying, at the completion, will the data go back 5 years? What's the rough time frame for when the data will be harmonized and open to the public? Well, right now, the first year of data that was published was 2018-19. Right, is that right? Did I say that right? Yeah, 18-19. And that came out in June 2020, or well, that was the deadline to release it. And I think a few states, waved the COVID flag and said, we're going to be late. But most states did get their data up. And so that's the first year. A couple of states were, we called ahead of the curve, and they were able to publish data for 17, 18, and we've captured that information as well. So that's how soon it is, but we will be, we have data right now where we can give people, it's just not sort of cross-state ready, but we should have, we're starting kind of state by state and loading it up, but we should, in a matter of months, have state data that are accessible and open to the public. Our issue is we also have to build an interface to make it downloadable and stuff, but we're also very eager to work with anybody whose timeline is more early, and we'll send you stuff. So I think what we're hoping is people will use the data and say things like, hey, I found this didn't work, or more clarification on this variable, or this, that, or the other. And we'll use the early feedback we get to perfect the data display or the data access or the terminal and all that kind of stuff. So that all of that is what we're working on. But the project was going to run about another 2.5 years, but we'll have data up long before then.
And one quick follow-up. Thanks again for an excellent presentation and really amazing work. So is the idea that we could do within state analyses because the reporting would be consistent within state, but it wouldn't be consistent across state just yet?
Generally speaking, yes. And we are, poor Lucy's nodding a lot at what I'm saying. She and a team of researchers at Georgetown and the Massive Data Institute, which is another group at Georgetown, are doing all this data validation. So we're looking through going, okay, something happened. Here's a school and they say they spend $17 per pupil. I'm pretty sure that's not what they spent. So we're doing that validation. So there may be states that you said, can I get this file right now? And you could even go to the state agency and you might be able to download their file right now. We would give it to you too, but we'd say, I haven't checked that one yet. Or we know this one has known errors in the area of this, that, and that. And we're happy to communicate that and work with people to try to get people as excited we are about using the data sooner rather than later. So we're going to keep doing this, and hopefully, I love the thumbs up. So hopefully at some point, we can actually maybe turn the whole project back over to the federal government where it feels like it should be. And there's all sorts of federal reasons you have to get Congress to appropriate a collection to do that it couldn't happen right now. But we're, we didn't want to wait. So that's why we are in the step that we're in. And many, I would say states they have their own websites up. We have something called the Data Hub at Edunomics Lab. If you go and click on the Data Hub, you can go straight to each state's own website. If they have some cool visualizations, those will be there. And you can even ask for alerts and we'll send you alerts about what we're learning about the data. But the Data Hub for us is a portal to get there. There's also newly released last week, the federal government created its own portal. And it basically, I think it emerged from this idea that it's very hard if you woke up, this morning and said, I wonder how much my kid's school spends. And they were kind of targeting this for parents, but my child goes to Maple Elementary. I think I'll sit down and figure out how much is spent at Maple Elementary. You could spend an hour, give up and walk away. But the new federal portal, you can type in your state, type in your school and go, there it is. But that doesn't mean that the data are comparable across places or you have that context. It's simply a scrape of what's on the websites. Excellent.
Okay, so
All right.
other questions or Ashley, are you seeing questions online?
I don't have anything to add at this point, but I will let you know if I do. I'll send you a private message.
Okay, well, I'll chime in because never when did I just like see the time. But I will say that we believe that finance is the most interesting area of education. And for anybody who thinks it's boring, not paying attention, more superintendents get fired before the end of their contract over financial issues than anything else. It's really where all the, we could say there's a lot of emotions in education, but really the emotions come out when money's at stake. And so there's just a lot of stories there. And it's been, I think, underappreciated because people didn't really know what to make of it, and school district budgets were very complicated, but they don't have to be. And if you step back from the budget and sort of ask the basic questions about how much does this cost, knowing that on average in the US, we spend $14,000 per pupil. So if something costs $5,000 per pupil, we better get something good out of it because that's going to be a big increase. So I think there's a lot of stories and engagement and exciting research to be done here. And we're expecting that a lot more of these finance stories will come out. I think finance got a bad rap because so much of it was on the nuance of these state funding formulas, which, Jan, is actually kind of boring, but important. And we should all pay attention to that. And that's where databases were going. But when you can actually look at stuff down to the level of schools, it comes to life in a different sort of way. We got a great question about, let's see, wait a minute, I'm looking. First, I'll look at Andrew's question. What would prevent someone from linearly adjusting using known state PPE to enable state-to-state comparison? Well, we're not going to do that for so many reasons. And that is because some states that do spend more, we're not trying to just, adjust for cost of living, but some states that do spend more because they've had a statewide investment in smaller class sizes. And we don't want to linearly adjust when we've now erased the very variation that we should be paying attention to. So you could do that. We would not do that. And some states spend, a lot on some things and less on others. And we sort of want that to be part of the totals. And I think it's the value isn't so much at looking at an entire state versus another entire state. It's looking at like schools in different states, because that's when we start learning about how the rest of the context sort of matters. And then we have the question about PTA funding. It's like literally always in the first hour of our certificate, somebody asks this question. It's like my favorite question. So a lot of people are fixated on the PTA funding question, thinking that's where the real inequities are. And I'll say sometimes there's some real inequities there. Ross in California, which is a very wealthy, beyond wealthy, like exponentially wealthy small community in Marin, just north of San Francisco, does PTA fundraising on the order of $4,000 a student. I've never seen anything like that anywhere else. Typically what we see for PTA fundraising would be something in the neighborhood of, even for a suburban sort of more affluent school, something in the neighborhood of $50 to $100 per pupil. And that would be a lot, right? Like I have kids and I have 4 of them. If I went to an auction and I spent $400, that would be like me donating, I'm assuming that that's after the cost of the dinner and everything else. $400 is $100 per pupil. It's a lot. But the flip side is that what districts are spending typically is in the neighborhood of $14,000 per pupil. And most PTAs aren't anywhere near even hitting 2% of that. So, or anything higher. And so I think the PTA one is like the most favorite story by journalists, but maybe not the most relevant story when it comes to looking at the whole pie. In fact, it sometimes seems like the decoy. That's not to say it couldn't be influential, but I saw a story on a Wisconsin district about how the district had accepted $40,000 or something for naming rights on the gym. It was some big issue, and the gym was going to be named for 10 years. And we divided it out by the number of kids per year that had access to that gym. And it was like $7 a student by the time we were done. And we were like, okay, this is not the big money. The big money is the 14,000 that we have in public funds. So I think that's one point I would make about that. But those are some of the fun things we dig into in our certificate on that. So the only thing I'll add about the PTA money is only one state, actually I think maybe 2 states, are including PTA money, ideally listed separately because we want to be able to take it in and put it back out, take it out and put it back in their totals. And that was Wisconsin and I believe maybe Montana. And so that's sort of an interesting thing, but that's partially because PTAs, their money's not in the district budget. So it's not like publicly accounted for. So that one is another issue.
So Marguerite, we got 3 questions, 3 people who are raising their hands to ask the question. They didn't put them in the chat box, that they've got their hand raised. Ginny Lovison, Jennifer Ash, and Eric Taylor. So why don't we go in that order? Ginny?
Thanks, Tom, and thanks, Professor Roza, for a wonderful presentation. I've learned a lot. I've been thinking about, towards the beginning of the presentation, when you were talking about seeing more variation between schools in terms of spending than between districts. And you mentioned that obviously there's dollars attached to students and dollars attached to teachers. More recently, we've been talking about the PTA, but are there any other like big factors that would be driving the variation in school spending between schools that I should have in mind?
Yeah, you should be thinking about all the things the district controls. But so for one, there's obviously Title I. That's a big one. And you have to kind of take into Title I into account. Special ed, if a school is a special ed focused school and they address, kids with autism or something, that could be a big driver. Sometimes even a single kid can drive spending on special ed. But district decisions about the teacher salaries, right? So if if senior teachers make a lot more than junior teachers. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But I showed the Seattle numbers there. The Seattle senior teacher salaries are up to $112,000 a year or something like that. Is for a senior teacher, it's a lot more than a junior teacher. It's more than double a junior teacher. So that could be driving those differences. But even the district could say, so school size is another one that could play a factor. It doesn't have to. Some districts say you get, $6,000 per kid. Too bad if you're small, you don't get extra money, deal with it. The principal maybe has to teach a class, but you're small, so the principal should be able to do that. We've seen that in a lot of cases. But some districts give small schools more money, and they do that by allocating them the same number of staff, but they have fewer kids, right? So they have a principal and a librarian and a nurse and a reading coach and a theater teacher. And by the time you divide those up, that might be lower. Sometimes districts, I remember we looked at Minneapolis and they had this new school, and it was sort of like this exciting school that the board put all its, gems and bells and whistles into. And it was, by the time they were done, the school cost twice as much as everything else. It had the science program and a fine arts program and a this and a that. And it was just really expensive. They put a lot of staff there. But in education, most of this is labor. It's really mostly labor. So I think we can look for different kinds of staffing counts. And sometimes it's just, there's a school, it's got half as many kids as it should have. We keep staffing it like it's full, and now it's really expensive. So every district, it seems, has its own story of why we're spending these unpredicted amounts on different schools. All right, so the next one was Jen.
Jen, yes.
Hey, Marguerite, thank you so much. I agree that school finance is a lot of fun, even though I haven't done it in a long time. I am the director of the Rural Center here at Harvard, and I currently work with 50 rural school districts, all of whom have only one school per level. And I'm curious if you can speak to any use cases for this school level finance data, given that many rural and small districts only have one school per level, so we can't look at differences between schools.
Yeah, so for a semester, I pulled my kids out of their urban schools that they go to in Seattle, and we went and lived in one of those districts, and my kids went to a school, 600 kids in the northern part of the county in their single school. The superintendent's office was right next to the principal's office, right next to the lockers, like it was the whole meal deal all in one building. And so, yeah, so one of the things we've actually been using a lot of school data. I did a project looking for ROI superstars among these small rural schools. So a lot of rural schools do have some sort of shared service provider that almost acts like their district. They give money to like a data center or somebody that manages the special ed stuff. And so a lot of times what we're looking at is almost a different relationship, almost that one that's like the charter arrangement where the district gets the money, but then they send some over to a shared service provider. And so what we're trying to do is line them up with similar peers and see under what conditions they beat the odds for their schools. Anyway, it was fun to actually be immersed in a situation like that, where my kids were taking like TV-based classes or whatever, because that's kind of how you make it all work in rural schools a lot of times. But I think that's how we can think about that, is to use other rural peers and then investigate the data across states and sort of see what it means, and then how they're sort of playing out their finances in that way.
Thank you.
Sure. And then we have Eric.
Hi, thanks, Marguerite. So one thing you emphasized, which I certainly learned from you just in this conversation, is that there is this potential sort of fuzziness or loophole about whether a district accounts for something at the school level or at the district level. And that's a primary consideration in comparisons across districts. So of course, a district we might think that is variation that we want to understand, like, one district chooses to, just as a random example, to have an in-house research department in the district and another one doesn't. Well, that does feel like an actual district expenditure, versus the example you gave where like a coach that really does feel like a school level expenditure is getting sort of somehow accounted for at the district level. So I wonder if you could give us a sense, maybe you know today, maybe not, of like how much variation there is in the between district variation in the proportion of monies that are
Accounted
for at the school versus the district level. And then maybe one step further, like, can you predict that variation? Is that like, you know, lower or higher achieving districts, rural, urban?
No, okay, so I would say that you see patterns from one state to the next. So Rhode Island, for instance, a lot of money is accounted for at the school. And Rhode Island worked hard on this with a statewide chart of accounts that was intended to account for every dollar by the schools. And they've been doing this for years, lots of training for every single CFO in every single district. And there are only certain costs that are allowed to be attributed to central office. And so their data set shows more at the school level and a smaller portion central. Some of those honestly could be the very same expenditures in the next state over accounted for at central office because it's their chart of accounts. So I don't know that you can learn a whole lot about that from looking at, let's say, schools in Connecticut versus schools in Rhode Island. But what you could do is look at across schools in Connecticut and then start to see those patterns. And so another example is in some states, it's very common to contract for transportation. And you hire a contractor, you write them a big check, and they do all the transportation. They're not going to be able to parse that by school because they don't even really, I mean, they could go back and say how many kids are each school transported, but most of us, that's not the most interesting expense we're worried about anyway. So if they just put that in central office, oh well, and that will be the case. And in the next state over, they might typically have that in the school's budget. I think where it gets interesting is if you find a school district in the state in a state that has higher than its peers central expenses. And I remember the district saying this, they were like, well, you know, we could just, if we want to hide money out of a school, we could just put it in our district budget. And we're like, yep. And then the central part will look greater. And then they go, oh God. And that's the thing districts hate is then people say, you spent all this money on central office. So they have this natural tendency to at least attempt to show things where they are realized because they get a lot of localized pushback on having more central. And I think we could look inside a state across districts and go, okay, just waving the flag here, 60% of your dollars are accounted for at the district. What's going on here? You only have 40% accounted for the school. And then I imagine in the first year of some of those districts will think, oh no, I got to do a better job of sort of looking at what I can legitimately count back at schools. So it's not a perfect a record of this, and part of this is going to be an investigation of the data as we go. But I wouldn't start by trying to make any huge conclusions the first year about their habits of spending based on the way they accounted for it. So.
Okay, well, I would expect that in the coming years, there'll be like a blossoming of research on the relationship between expenditures and outcomes. I think part of the reason why there's not been as much research in this area as in the past is due to the data shortages. And as the data become more available and states start to use common standards for how they're defining different items, which will come, even if it may take a few years. I think it's very exciting, and I'm sure that there'll be some of the students on this call are already trying to think about how they can use these data in the work that they're doing. So I just wanted to thank Marguerite for joining us, and thank everybody both on YouTube and on Zoom for joining us today. Ashley, when's our next one of these?
So our next peer seminar is going to be on October 6th with Angela Duckworth on the science of character.
Okay, so great. So thank you for joining us today. Hope to see you on October 6th, but let's thank Marguerite.
Thanks for having me and letting me talk about data. I just really appreciate it. It was fun.
Right. Thanks, Marguerite.
Yep, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And for the fellows who will be joining us afterwards for our director's cut, our private session with our fellows, unfortunately, we're having continued technical difficulties with this room. So I'm sending you an email with a direct link to the room I'd like us to switch to. Thank you so much.
Okay. And you'll send it to Marguerite and me and
Correct,
Lucy,
yes.
if Lucy wants to join us.
We will log off and see you on the other side.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right.